Tom Brown's father hopes, when he loads him into the stagecoach on his way to Rugby, that he will turn out a brave, helpful, truth-telling Englishman and gentleman and Christian. The three nouns in that sentence are pretty interesting, aren't they? It seems odd, first of all, that a father should hope that by sending his English boy to school, he will turn into an Englishman. Isn't that more or less the outcome one would expect, absent any intervention? And, of course, Tom is being sent to a gentleman's school, in part to get him away from women and from the non-gentleman ushers at his private school, so, again, one would expect that he would grow up to be a gentleman, a status that is in any case guaranteed by his being the firstborn son of a county squire. And last on that list, Christian. It almost seems like an afterthought. What is the point of including it? As Dieter Petzold points out in the essay you read for this week, school stories are even less concerned with the teaching of Latin or mathematics than the actual schools. Their primary interest is moral education and character forming. In this case, the moral education doesn't mean formation of religious or other values we might think of as morality. Instead, Petzold is referring to training in the ethics of a particular class, the ruling class of Britain. With that in mind, we can go back to the quotation I cited earlier, Tom's father hoping he will turn into an Englishman, a gentleman, and a Christian. We can see that these are moral terms, not social descriptors. To be an Englishman is to have certain qualities. It has little or nothing to do with being born in England or having English forebears. If you remember the essay on ideology we read at the beginning of the course, we can begin to see how this works. Ideology is all about replicating the class structure that underpins an economic system. It happens invisibly. We are hailed, recognize the hail, and respond to it at a point in our lives when we are too young to know that we had a choice. It is a process through which individuals of different race, class, and sex are worked into a particular lived relation to a socio-historical project, which means that it is a system that tells us what it means to be a person like me in the time that I live. Key to the way ideology works is that it asserts itself as natural rather than cultural. If I am a woman in the 19th century, for instance, I don't think I experience the world as I do because my ideology instructs me that the meaning of being a woman in the 19th century is. Rather, I think that all the things I think about myself and the way I fit into my world are natural, inevitable, the only way things could be, or at least so hard to change that there's no point in trying. When Tom Brown's father hopes he will grow up to be an Englishman, he is using Englishman ideologically. Same thing for gentleman and Christian, by the way. He is not looking for Tom to hold a series of doctrinal beliefs in hopes of saving his immortal soul, but is instead thinking of Christianity in terms of its social dominance in his location. In fact, Englishman, gentleman, and Christian are all really synonyms for one another in Mr. Brown's formulation. He would probably have a hard time imagining an Englishman who was not a Christian, though there were plenty of Englishmen who followed different religions or no religion at all, and I wouldn't be shocked at all to find that he believes all gentlemen must be English. Foreigners could never understand the subtleties of being a gentleman, could they? Well, we are probably all foreigners to Tom's father, but maybe that gives us a place to begin looking at what the spoken and unspoken components of being an English gentleman really are. What values does the school celebrate? What kinds of behavior are validated, and what kinds repressed? Let's look at the passage in Chapter 9, where Tom gets in trouble for fishing on the wrong side of the bank. I would categorize this as a minor sin. The boys think the rule is ridiculous, and it is routinely flaunted. And we know that the final outcome is that Tom, with the keeper's blessing, continues to fish on the wrong side of the bank. What's interesting is what Tom learns about how to deal with social inferiors in this scene. There are crossed lines of authority here. Tom is a young gentleman, but he is a boy, and thus subject to both his school's rules and to governance by adults more generally, even when those adults don't have the authority of gentlemen. The keeper is a working-class man, so lower than Tom on the social scale, but He has the authority of his employer. His job is to keep the boys off the employer's property. When Tom runs into the keeper, he acknowledges the keeper's authority by running away from him and hiding in the tree. If Tom could boss the keeper around, he wouldn't have to do that. And then Tom compounds his sin by calling the keeper velveteens, an insult based on the clothing the keeper is wearing, which is also a sign of the keeper's class status. And then, to make matters worse, he offers the keeper a bribe to let him go. Tom has completely misread the power structure he's in, and he's also fallen shy of how a young gentleman should behave. He does get himself back together. In a parody of the kind of parole prisoners of war used to be able to expect from their captors, if they were gentlemen, he assures the keeper that he won't run away, and thus the keeper needn't take hold of him to go to see the doctor. And when the doctor flogs him for his transgression, he takes the punishment quietly. Afterwards, though, he makes a new relation with the keeper. He offers him a tip rather than a bribe. The distinction is important because higher status people tip lower status ones, while those without power bribe those with it. He recognizes that the keeper has a legitimate place in the social sphere and his own claim to dignity. This recognition turns out to be a key part of the behavior of a gentleman, because a true gentleman acts according to his position in the social sphere and recognizes when to accord respect to others and on what grounds. The adjectives Tom's father uses in describing his hope for his son at school give us key insight into the qualities of an Englishman, a gentleman, or a Christian. First, you should be brave. This is often described as pluck in school stories. We see examples in Tom's first football game and also in some of his escapades, such as when he climbed the clock tower. Second, you should be helpful. The position of a gentleman in English society at that time was as a beneficiary of a social system that sent money and assets upstream to him, but also created obligations for him to his tenant farmers, his domestic servants, and the people of his village more generally. If you had a dispute with a neighbor, you would go to the squire to get it resolved. If your child was ill, the squire's wife would know about it and would see that some beef tea was sent over from her kitchen. So helpfulness justified a social system in which some people, through accident of birth, clearly benefited the most by suggesting that the system was in fact one of mutual dependence and helpfulness. Truth-telling is also a very important descriptor of gentlemanly qualities. In English society at this time, a widespread ideology was that a gentleman's word was his bond. This was supposed to separate him from lower classes in his own society, but especially from foreigners, who were generally viewed as untrustworthy. Looking at this now, from our 21st century perspective, we can see the ways this ideology was based on failure to understand others. For example, in American usage, we have the offensive term Indian giving, used when someone gives something and then takes it back. European settlers in America had different ideas of property rights than did Native Americans. Europeans thought that land could be divided up among various owners, and that once you owned the property, you could do anything you liked with it. Native Americans tended not to understand land use this way, and so the Europeans' insistence on knowing who land belonged to and claiming it if there wasn't a designated owner led to disputes with the native peoples, who very justifiably saw the European way as destructive encroachment. English people in their imperial stage were fairly unaccommodating of the notion that there could be multiple ways to do things or think about problems. Thus, instead of attempting to understand the others they encountered as they traveled the globe, establishing an empire on which the sun never set, they typically compared the behavior and motivations of people they met unfavorably to the English way. For Tom, never telling a lie is a very important part of being an English gentleman, and we know from Bunter in The Magnet that failing in this area pretty well rules one out as a gentleman at all. As you look at The Magnet, it's interesting to compare Bunter's lies with Harry Wharton's truth-telling. Sometimes Harry cannot tell the literal truth because he's been sworn to secrecy or because doing so would disrupt the schoolboy code of never ratting out another boy. But of course, he cannot lie either, so he often has to find ways to not tell the truth without literally telling a lie. Your forum post this week will encourage you to think about what kinds of behaviors or qualities are essential to being a gentleman. What do these qualities tell you about how gentlemen fit into the culture? What role do they play? How does ideology help support the class structure in which English gentlemen are the top dogs?